Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for another session of Why Marx. As comrades know, this series is accompanying the communist fusion process that is currently taking place, involving three communist organizations in Britain who are clear in their aim, relatively clear. We want to build a united, a democratic communist party that allows differences and open debate, and fights for what's needed, not what we think is acceptable to the ruling class or those who think we have to maybe build alliances with the Green Party, which is the latest thing I'm hearing. Today, we want to look at the CPGB, as was the Communist Party of Great Britain, founded in 1920, liquidated in 1991-92. Why does it matter looking back at that history? I think there's at least two reasons that are really crucial still. Firstly, I think need to look back and see what we can learn from those 70 years, what we could probably, positive lessons from it, and also what we want to avoid in our own efforts to build a communist party. But also, I think we should look at the declining but ongoing influence of the CPGB history on the current left in Britain. Jeremy Corbyn, for example, was an ardent supporter of the method, if not actual parts, of the CPGB's program, The British Road to Socialism. Hopefully we will get into that, because that might be news to some comrades, but there's at least two of the reasons why we have to study this history. We should know our history in any case. So we got two good speakers tonight who are experts on the issue. There's Lawrence Parker, who's been blogging on this history and has also done research, massive research on the history of the CPGB, and Jack Conrad from the Communist Party of Great Britain as it is today. So we're going to start with Lawrence, who's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're handing over to Jack, and then questions and contributions from the floor. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Tina, and thanks everybody. In my introduction, Tina talked about talking about why the CPGB matters. Hopefully that might come out in the discussion a bit. What I'm gonna try and cover foolishly in about 30 minutes is an outline kind of history of the CPGB from the 1920s through to its dissolution in 1991. Just bear in mind as you're listening to this, I'm not going to be able to cover every single episode that the CPGB underwent in detail. And 2 weeks ago, you heard about an important turning point of the CPGB's history that Jack talked about, the general strike. That is obviously there's that turning point, and there's a number of other kind of turning points that are very important. But this is going to be a kind of somewhat angular presentation and quite quick. So I am inevitably going to miss out quite a lot of detail. So obviously, each of these kind of sub-episodes that I'm going to talk about in the history of the CPGB, each of them could be given its own kind of session, in of itself. And obviously, each of these subdivisions has provoked many historical debates and lots of research. So this is really going to be a very quick and fast presentation from me. And what it really is going to try to give you, hopefully, it will give you at least an outline kind of hypothesis of why the CPGB came to grief and why it kind of was liquidated in 1991. It's nothing more than a hypothesis that I'm offering to you. So obviously, that can come out in the debate. But basically, kind of what it's trying to do is if somebody, in the unlikely event that somebody came up to you in the pub later on this evening and said, "Do you know why the CPGB was liquidated?" Hopefully, this session might give you the basis for some kind of answer for that. So yeah, with that in mind, I'm going to kind of plunge straight into this because I haven't got very much time. I'm going to start kind of where Jack finished 2 weeks ago. Jack talked about the general strike and the failure of the general strike and the failures and the achievements of the CPGB in relationship to the general strike. Well, I'm going to talk about something to start off with that ran parallel to that, which was the process of Bolshevization. Now, this is often treated, Bolshevization happened in the CPGB from the mid 1920s, and it's often treated entirely negatively as marking the beginning of the subordination of the CPGB to the Comintern, to Comintern diktat, to being molded and shaped by the Comintern, and it's often treated as the kind of beginning of that kind of process of decline, where the CPGB subordinated itself ever more to the Soviet Union. Now that's true, so I'm not saying that that's not a true part of the process. But Bolshevization in Britain was very actually, I would say, very, very contradictory from when I've studied it. In practical terms, it did mean that the CPGB was more put under the microscope of the Comintern, and there was more Comintern involvement. However, not all of that involvement was negative. Some of it was, some of it kind of wasn't in the 1920s. But I'm going to leave that aside really and concentrate on the other kind of side of Bolshevization. In practical terms, the Bolshevization in some sections of the CPGB, it meant an attempt to win advance workers to communism, and that was a kind of process that was kind of initiated, and it was partly kind of positive. And what I'm kind of thinking of in this period is the National Left Wing movement, which the CPGB launched in 1925, 26, to struggle inside the Labour Party, basically with a programme of democratic demands that attacked the British monarchical state. And the object of the National Left Wing movement was precisely to differentiate the CPGB and the communists from the rest of the Labour left. Previous to this time, the CPGB struggle inside the Labour Party had been much less well coordinated, much more mushy, and much more prone to opportunism. Actually, the National Left Wing movement, although again we're talking about something that's very contradictory and had very many negative points as well as many positive points, there was a clear accent on it that was healthy. The CPGB in this period also had an effective weekly paper, the Sunday Worker. And the Sunday Worker, what was interesting about that, as opposed to the CPGB's, some of the CPG's future publications, the Daily Worker I'm more thinking about here, but the Sunday Worker ran a debate on all sorts of topics, but mostly on the Labour Party, with advanced workers and the working class autodidacts, which you can read about in Stuart McIntyre's kind of work, around the Labour left. And so the CPGB was actually debating with a, a comparatively advanced constituency of workers who'd had some education in the politics of Marxism. We're talking about workers who were in organizations such as the ILP, and that were around the plebs movement and all sorts of other kind of cultural organizations. And the Sunday Worker was a paper of debate. And when the CPGB decided to wrap up the national left-wing movement in the end of the 1920s, in the columns of the Sunday Worker, you can see all of these the non-CPGB left debating with the CPGB, and you can see reports of the Congress at the end of the national left-wing movement where some of the rank and file of that organization, non-communists, didn't want it to be closed, and they argued in a kind of Marxist kind of idiom. So in a sense, the and this happened in the kind of the second half of the 1920s up until about 1929, when the CPGB closed down the national left-wing movement and closed the Sunday Worker and then launched a daily paper, the Daily Worker. So this was a particular type of period. Now I'm isolating this thing as a kind of positive thing, and I'm sure other people will point to other negative kind of things. But this was a quite unique phase of the CPGB's existence, that existed in the 1920s, but particularly from this point of Bolshevization, when precisely the point of Bolshevization, part of the emphasis was on differentiation of communism, building the Communist Party in whatever flawed and bureaucratic centric not eccentric, centrist ways the CPGB undertook that. So I'm pulling this Bolshevization kind of period out and the work inside the national left wing movement as a kind of contrast to what came afterwards. And we're going to move on very quickly into the third period, which followed on from the period of the national left-wing movement. So the third period was in the late 20s and early 1930s. And basically, at this period, the CPGB took a sectarian approach to work inside the Labour Party, inside the Labour movement, and it's often caricatured as an era in which the CPGB only talked about communism and maximalist demands. In fact, though, if you look in the third period, the CPGB turned its back on the kind of constituency it was talking to in the earlier part of the 1920s of advanced workers, and instead it looked to undercut the mainstream of the labour movement with a kind of unremitting diet of immediate agitational demands aimed at the proletarian broad mass. So that's often you'll often see this type of politics inside the third period. You can see it in the Class Against Class electoral program in 1929, where yes, you do have a lot of maximalist communist demands, but all these programs and mini programs, as perhaps you could just about call the 1929 Class Against Class, although it was actually an electoral document, a document for the general election. So the CPGB always put the accent, and this remained true throughout their history from this point onwards. There was this idea that you had the big labour movement battalions to your right in the trade unions and the Labour Party, and the way fundamentally to undercut this was through agitation. It wasn't through in the proletarian mass movement. It wasn't about propaganda. It wasn't primarily about propaganda. It wasn't primarily, and the CPGB stopped engaging with this constituency of advanced workers, although inevitably the reality of it was that this was their readership to some degree. What also became apparent in the late 20s and 1930s is that and particularly as you go into the late 1930s, it became more difficult for the CPGB to attempt to win the hearts and minds of the working class with what Harry Pollock called the gleam of socialism in the Soviet Union. This faded in relative importance. The CPGB's espousal of the Soviet Union as a utopian society of the future became much more difficult once kind of Trotsky's criticisms of Stalin and the bureaucratic regime in the Soviet Union became known across the Labour left. This was widely known across the ILP. Now, it's perfectly true to say that there was also supporters of the Soviet Union in the British Labour movement who were non-communist. Everybody knows about the Webs, Soviet communism, the new civilization question mark. They dropped the question mark from the later edition, and there were lots of people attracted to the idea of the Soviet Union's so-called planned economy as capitalism was moving into crisis in the late 1920s. And you can read all about those. Paul Fleurs has got a book that deals with this kind of issue that I recommend that you read. But it became much more difficult by the late 1930s to hark really to the Soviet Union as some kind of alternative society when you've got a society that's undergoing show trials, purges, and these were widely reported upon in the bourgeois media, in the left media. So this was a challenge kind of narrative, and it became more. It's not that the CPGB, of course, didn't proselytize for the Soviet Union and an attempt to like win people with ideas of social progress, 1 million tractors built in 1932 and all that type of stuff, because it did. But it just became much more difficult to really like pose that as a future alternative for the CPGB. Hence, when we go into the Popular Front, The Popular Front, obviously, there was a big shift over to the shift towards bourgeois, progressive kind of politics of peace. Okay, with the idea which was to build a peace front with the Soviet Union. So that pushed the CPGB to the right to try and get different groups to the right to work with them to build this pro-Soviet peace front against Nazism or whatever it may be. But the underlying thread of the CPGB's domestic politics didn't change. And if you look at the way they explained their work inside the Popular Front, is they're still in agitational mode. They're still about appealing to kind of basic economic demands. And when they did kind of work inside the labor movement and other movements for peace, they tended to boil it down to the most simplistic agitational kind of slogans. And by like 38, 39, if you read the Daily Worker, it's quite depressing because it's kind of very low level, you know, peace politics. Well, they'll join anybody who's kind of willing to be on a platform with a communist or willing to say nice things about the Soviet Union or that Britain should ally itself with the Soviet Union in a diplomatic pact. But the fundamental thrust of this is agitational. And again, the whole like notion of advanced workers dealing with the process of differentiation of communism, amongst an educated group of workers. Although this did happen, and the CPGB was primarily an organization of educated autodidacts, the same as the others, the emphasis on that in popular terms inside the CPGB was very weak. So we've come now on a white kind of knuckle ride through the 20s and 30s, and it kind of this kind of reaches its apex in the CPGB when it comes to draw up its draft program of 1939. It was a draft because it never came to fruition because of the Second World War and other events which I don't have time to go into. But when you look inside that draft program, there were two processes inside it. One was the kind of old uh, uh, programs of the Lenin's RSDLP of the 1903 and kind of later, which had an impact and which they talked about. They were also influenced by the programs of German social democracy. And you'll see inside the draft program the demand for the workers' democratic republic and an accent upon democratic rights. But the other half of the draft program was just flooded with agitational demands, and a much more basic kind of cut down, cut price kind of program for dealing with the immediate impact of the Second World War. And when the CPGB covered this draft program, that's on the immediate parts, the agitational parts, and the other stuff about their demand for a workers' democratic republic, that was all inevitably sidelined, and this program died a death anyway. Inside during again, we're going to leap on very quickly. During the Second World War, there were a number of interesting shifts that happened inside the CPGB. They kind of had an inkling of what an alternative uh, uh, mode of the party might be during the Second World War, in that you had a situation that after 1941, the Soviet Union was the ally of Britain during the Second World War. So the Soviet Union suddenly became popular, and that fed through to the CPGB. The CPGB grew from something like 20,000 members in 1940 when it was opposing the war to 45,000 at the end of the war, and it had even been higher. It had even been 56 in 1942 when the Soviets had victory at Stalingrad, and I was going to say kind of defiance of the Nazi regime, but that sounds like I'm kind of making a fetish of it. I'm not. I don't mean to do that, but what I'm trying to get across is Stalin and the Soviet Union were incredibly popular amongst and feted on the BBC etc., etc., etc. And the communists became kind of popular because they were swimming with the tide. But their politics during the Second World War were like piss weak, kind of reformist kind of politics, opposing strikes, etc., etc., etc. But it did give them a kind of future vision where they're swimming with the tide. The Soviet Union's popular, so that there was a kind of this, and that became apparent as the war came on, and they did discuss. There were apparently discussions on liquidating the Communist Party in some form, but it gave them a vision of being an alternative to what, not a communist party that was out to struggle for an alternative communist society, but something like a reformist organization that was a pro-Soviet reformist organization, and that could link itself to other so-called progressive forces, including conservatives, Churchill, who were also on the Soviet Union side. It gave them a type of alternative a vision for their party, really. And this kind of did come to fruition in post 1945. Um, During the 1930s, the Labour Party, the Communist Party had sent, in the second half of the 1930s, the Communist Party had sent large amounts of its cadre inside the Labour Party. And it became obvious to their Soviet handlers that this was very useful because although Stalin was not interested in a British revolution, it was useful, even in the dog days of 1940, when you had hidden communists standing up at Labour conference, hailing the Soviet Union's winter war in Finland, episodes like that. That was kind of useful that was it wasn't the be all and end all, but it was at least useful for Stalin and the Soviet leadership in that these demands were being raised in under from capitalism's kind of second 11 in the belly of the beast of British imperialism. That was useful. And then what happened after the Second World War in the 1945 election? So yes, two open communists were elected to parliament alongside about a group of 10 or others that the CPGB headquarters was laughing on election day, according to what an insider, Douglas Hyde, who worked on the Daily Worker and wrote a famous book called I Believed. He said they were laughing on election day because suddenly they realised that 10 or 11 of the Labour MPs were crypto communists, communists in all but name, members of the party. That actually became useful in the opening stages of the opening stages of the Cold War. As I say, Stalin's Soviet leadership was no longer interested in a British revolution. However, having a ginger group of like Labour and Communist MPs voicing all the foreign policy concerns of the USSR in the British Parliament, that's useful. And when it began to influence a bigger block of Labour members like Kony Ziliakis and others who weren't exactly crypto communists but very sympathetic, this, when it began, say, the bloc, I can't remember what the exact figures have been put on this, but there was about 50 or 60 Labour MPs in Parliament in the 1945 Labour government who were kind of broadly pro-Soviet. So this was useful to Stalin, incredibly useful, and this was really the future vision of what the Communist Party was meant to be inside the British road to socialism. However, Clement Attlee's Labour leadership moved to expel this bloc of pro CPGB Labour sympathisers, such as Dennis Pritt was one of them, the lawyer Dennis Pritt. And this group was excluded from the Labour Party, and it failed to win any seats in the 1950 election when they stood under the Labour Independent Group. There was 5 of them in the end. So this bloc was broken up and smashed by Attlee. But despite its defeat, and this never reappeared again, the communists never had an MP after 1950, and this bloc never appeared in British politics. There were pro-Labour MPs, pro-Soviet Labour MPs, but there was never anything like this bloc that had appeared. But despite its defeat, it was this strategy that was enshrined in the CPGB's 1951 British Road to Socialism. This was basically what the British Road Socialism does is it tries to bring to life in programmatic form this idea of a Labour communist bloc. And in the British Road to Socialism, rather than just being a pain in the arse to Clement Attlee and voicing Stalin's foreign policy, the whole idea behind the British Road to Socialism is so-called Labour government of a new type. So a Labour government of a new type existed by various communist MPs, left Labour MPs, enacting the first steps of a parliamentary kind of path to liberation in alliance with the Soviet Union, which by 1945, by the way, had its tanks on the River Elbe in the centre of Europe. This is the kind of perspective. What I want to get across to the listeners really is that but already in 1951, when this program's adopted and agreed to, Stalin tells Pollitt that this here's our program, and Pollitt agrees to enact this. It is summing up what's happened in the previous years, but this is dead. This has already been smashed up. The Communist Labour bloc has already been gone, and it's a bit of a fantasy that the CPGB. So already by 51, the CPGB's domestic strategies is smashed. And so I'm going to very, very quickly move on in the last bit of this to the kind of final years. So we have this idea that the CPGB's got no strategy now. It has got a strategy, but it's a kind of an idea of something that's already gone and ceased to be. But by 1956, the crisis year of international communism, the CPGB was effectively defeated. So its strategy was in tatters. Despite this strategy, as Tina said, even though this strategy was in tatters, the idea of a succession of left-moving Labour governments, that's always been the strategy since then of the Labour left, right up until Corbyn. But in 56, the CPGB's association with the Soviet Union, which had already looked a bit iffy during the Cold War, it now became thoroughly kind of toxic after Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin's dictatorship and the Soviet Union's intervention into Hungary in 1956, which stepped up the Cold War a notch. And now the party began to be it was by this point being routinely demonized in the bourgeois media, and there was a certain purge of communists in the civil service on an earlier period. And the Soviet Union was, of course, the force that the CPGB was meant to be serving with the British Road to Socialism, i.e., pro-Soviet, non-revolutionary reformism through the bourgeois institution of the Labour Party. The Soviet Union's just become a thoroughly toxic institution and a state, and not just among Labour Party members or bourgeois society, but also among communists as well. Obviously, the CPGB shed about 25% of its 20% of its membership during 56 and 57, something like that. I can't remember the exact figure. So I'm gonna jump forward now into the 60s and 70s and talk about the CPGB as what I call the right centrist leadership of the CPGB in the 1960s and 70s. So by this point, its leadership was it was rightist in the sense that it was always on an opportunist political trajectory. It was always looking to weaken the pulse of its politics. But it was the leadership of the CPG was centrist, right centrist, because it also had to preserve the party, at least for a period, in order to retain its own position and status. Um, its aim was to keep its prestige and authority and relative power intact. Unfortunately, part of its authority was based on the Soviet Union and the leadership of the Soviet Union. It was also based on the Soviet Union having to sub the party serious money after the shortage in Jews, after they lost all the membership exodus in 56 and 57, and it relied on Soviet money to support the daily worker. But also as well that unfortunately for the CPGB's leadership, most of the rank and file of the CPGB that was left after 56 was probably even that it had a left and centre that were firmly pro-Soviet, and probably the majority of the party was still fairly pro-Soviet. So the CPGB wants to preserve itself, but it can't really step away from these kind of intricate relationships. And it couldn't become probably what it desired most to, which is a purely British reformist party. That wasn't possible for the CPGB in the late 50s, 60s, and 60s. Rather, what the leadership began to do was, especially under General Secretary John Gollan, who succeeded Harry Pollitt, who'd been appointed under Stalin in 1929, what they began to do is kind of incrementally distancing the CPGB from the Soviet Union, although they didn't stop supporting the Soviet Union, but it did culminate in at least the CPGB's leadership, the majority of the CPGB publicly disapproving of the 1968 military intervention in Czechoslovakia. So in the last 5 minutes of this, I'm going to cover briefly what happened at the end of the CPGB. So in the 70s and 80s, we had the rise of what was known as the Euro-communist faction, which is a complicated subject. But in the 70s and 80s, the right-centrist leadership sponsored and fostered the rise of this faction of younger, generally younger Euro-communists through the party machine. Eurocommunism had a kind of ideological lineage that kind of emanated from Togliatti's Italian Communist Party, and they kind of stressed the idea that national communist parties should have autonomy, which they called polycentrism, from the Soviet Union. Euro communists also in their practice adapted themselves to women's movements, anti-racist movements, peace movements, and so they had an undeserved kind of trendy or kind of radical wrapping, whereas in reality all these people were about was adapting to bourgeois feminism, to the peace movement, etc. But absorbing and making use of these currents was useful from the CPGB's elderly leadership's point of view, because it allowed it to start projecting an image of being, more national, progressive, and in kind of in tune with the times, while also clinging on to some of the party's ideological heritage. Eurocommunism, so-called polycentrism and Eurocommunism, wasn't very original, given that it was a reworking of the national roads to socialism idea that had actually been pioneered by Stalin himself when he oversaw the 1951 British Road to Socialism. And Stalin Union gave a lot of publicity to the British Road to Socialism as a kind of model road for other communist parties in the West and elsewhere, and in places like South America. But by fostering the Euros, as this faction became pejoratively known in this manner, the older right centrist leadership could also usefully play that faction off against the CPGB's pro-Soviet left. The pro-Soviet left, which was on the left of the party, which had a kind of subjective, kind of revolutionary stance on many issues, but was firmly supportive of whatever Soviet leadership was in control at that point. This was firmly embedded into the party by the 60s, and that had its own alternative chain of command, and that's where people like Jack started their careers in communism. In the CPGB's other crisis year of 1977, 57 and 77 were the CPGB's crisis year, when the party's left and centre left was kind of in rebellion against a new draft of the British Road to Socialism. The older leadership kind of attempted to act as a broker between the left and the younger Euro communists. And if you watch the television programs that were produced at the time by Granada TV, Decision British Communism, it's called, you can find one of the episodes on YouTube. You can see the older right centrist leadership having to throw a few bones to the pro-Soviet left, given that quite a lot of the pro-Soviet left had left in 1977 and decamped to form. They were led by the Surrey CPGB, and which would form something with people from other areas of the new Communist Party. And this holding pattern, which is what it is, this kind of the idea of the old Stalinist leadership, you could call them that, I suppose, as a rough shorthand. Their holding pattern, which was balancing them out as a sort of Bonaparte amongst these various factions, that became untenable by the 1980s, and I'm reaching the end, you'll be glad to know. So I'm going to talk briefly about the 1980s, and we're going now towards the liquidation of the party in 1991. The old right centrist leadership's Achilles heel was that its continued survival relied upon it being tolerated by the pro-Soviet left and by the Soviet leadership. By the 1980s, this was unlikely to appeal to a rightward shifting labour movement, or the kind of shift to the right that was happening, say, in the Labour Party from the kind of mid 1980s. That old kind of left, the pro-Soviet left, was very unlikely to appeal to this, and the Euro communist faction, which by this time was grouped around a party magazine called Marxism Today, it kind of had its eyes on being the ideological helpers and advisors of such a drift among people like Neil Kinnock, which was a kind of modern day adaptation of the British road to socialism. But instead of aiding a shift to the left, the Euro communists wanted to aid a shift to the right in the Labour movement. Also, the old right centrist bureaucracy was itself beginning to fragment, with the rebellion of Tony Chater, Morning Star editor, and Mike Hicks, print worker and trade unionist, who saw independence for the party's paper from the increasingly Euro-dominated Communist Party of Great Britain. These two figures, they were from the CPGB's bureaucracy. They had no particular history on the party's left, and indeed were the sworn enemies of people in the new Communist Party and Sid French and Surrey CPGB. However, what happened with this UDI from the Morning Star, it meant that the CPGB lost its daily paper because the idea of Chater and Hicks was to make the Morning Star a Labour movement newspaper, and they not a CPGB paper, and they called the CPGB an outside body. So basically, the CPGB was asset stripped of its daily paper, and this, I think, really threw the CPGB, which by this point was being increasingly led by Eurocommunists. They became frustrated with the General Secretary, Gordon McLennan's kind of relative kind of tardiness in dealing with these opposition elements in Eurocommunist ideas. The strategy of pacifying pro-Soviet or CPGB trade unionists, any of those people committed to some sort of class struggle, was holding back the Euro-communist attempt to project itself into mainstream progressive politics. And it was also beginning to strip it of some of the assets that will be useful to promote their future careers. The CPGB had considerable physical assets, and Marxism Today was subsidized to a significant degree by the party, but the party also had property and all sorts of other kind of assets. The Euro communists wanted to lay hold of these assets, and these assets these days are disposed of by some truly dreadful elements. So after the Morning Star Rebellion, the Euro communists, they unleashed an absolutely unprecedented wave of expulsions and disciplinary actions against the CPGB's rank and file, and they took the party into a final spiral of liquidation, and it was finally destroyed in December 1991, and then the Euro-communist faction launched the short-lived Democratic Left, basically on the basis of the CPGB's old physical assets. They didn't take very many of the members. However, the British bourgeois media was no longer interested in the Euro-communists after they broke up the CPGB. As far as the bourgeois media was concerned, job done, thank you very much, and now you can retire. And those attached to the Morning Star split from the CPGB in 1988 to form today's Communist Party of Britain. So I'm finally going to just conclude this. So the destruction of the CPGB is a demonstration of the inherent unsustainability of Marxist organizations that are precluded from being able to herald the good news of communism and an alternative society. Soviet disinterest in the British Revolution and the fact that the CPGB could not hold an unchallenged space for a positive narrative around the socialism in the Soviet Union and elsewhere from quite early on left the party's leadership casting around for a new role presage initially on making itself useful to Stalin and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This strategy of a communist Labour voice in Parliament and the Labour Party itself was in ruins the year before the adoption of the British Road to Socialism in 1951. The whole notion of a role in British society on the basis of being useful to the Soviet Union was flawed, given that the official communist movement was moving into crisis, and despite brief interregnums during the Second World War and perhaps a little bit later with Gorbachev as well, respectable opinion inside the Labour movement and out was kind of virulently hostile to existing communism in the East. So liquidation of the early revolutionary potential of the CPGB was actually a critical factor in its downfall. It had no specific role. Its whole role was really making itself useful to other people and other forces. Other paths of becoming a junior kind of British reformist party or a helper of a failed Soviet experiment left it bereft of identity and purpose. So it was this that really played out after 1945 and led to the liquidation of the CPGB. And I'll finish that there.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Very, as you said, a white knuckle ride through the history of the Communist Party, but very, very interesting. And after Jack has spoken, I'm going to ask some questions, and other comrades, I'm sure, has also got some comments there. I should say we are going to look at the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, in the next few sessions. So there's a bit of a chat and discussion there going on. We'll touch on it, no doubt, but we will visit that question in more detail in some of the future sessions, just to let comrades know. Over to you, Jack. Thanks very much, Lawrence.
Yeah, I was noticing the chat going on about profit and surplus product and all the rest of it. But yeah, my subject, along with Lawrence today, is the CPGB. Should stress that Lawrence is much more of an expert than I am. I don't view myself as an expert on the history of the CPGB. I view myself very much as a sort of product of it in terms of my, earliest political formation. And obviously, my title today at the bottom of my screen is Jack Conrad, CPGB, weekly worker. Anyway, my basic starting point with the CPGB is it was a party. And I know nowadays we've got loads of left groups that call themselves parties. My own view would be it's a very small party, and I'm basically taking the word party as being something a part of. So it's actually a part of the working class. And I think I would make the argument that in 1920, it was the advanced part of the working class. And I would actually make the argument, good, bad, and indifferent, is that it remained part of the class. Excuse me. I'm in the middle of a meeting. It's all right. Okay, I'll speak to you in a little while. I would make the argument that it remained a class party towards the end, until towards the end. And that means, in my view, that whatever horror stories that we might want to trade, and they're fair enough, we need to understand that this was an experience, or should we put it like this? It was the highest experience of the working class in Great Britain. Why? Because it began as a party that was inspired by events in Russia. And of course, we're not just talking about a Russian revolution, we're talking about the world revolution. It was part of Comintern. Its politics were taken from the most advanced example, i.e. Bolshevism. And however much the Euro communists, for example, might have wanted to distance themselves from that, that remained. I mean, if you ask someone on the streets in the 1960s, what was the Communist Party? The chances are they would start talking about the Soviet Union, the October Revolution, or something like that. They're much more likely to talk about that than they would the British Road to Socialism, or Lawrence's, what was it, 10 MPs, whatever it was, you know, after 1945. It was the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union that people would have thought. And they would have thought both in terms of Stalin, but they would also have thought in terms of October 1917, Lenin. And yeah, they would have also thought about Trotsky and all the rest of it. Okay. Because again, you know, I'm less of an expert, more someone who was there, if you see the point. I would question what you said there, Lawrence, about the British Road. I mean, I'm not a supporter, by the way, of the British Road, but I would question whether it was in ruins, you know, by the time it was written in 1951, when the Communist Party lost its, not only its 2 MPs, but you know, it's the crypto communists were purged or not re-elected or whatever. My own experience was that at a local level and at a national level, the Labour left was guided by the CPGB. The Labour left, I mean, there might have been elements that didn't think this, but the Labour left in general took its political lead from the CPGB. In terms of, you know, Labour Party conference, Lawrence talks about 16 St John Street, the sort of official CPGB headquarters, celebrating in 1945 not only 2 MPs, but fellow travellers. My experience was that there were an awful lot of fellow travellers in the Labour Party. You know, all you need to do is talk about the alternative economic strategy. You know, if you take foreign policy, so, you know, pro-Cuba, pro-Vietnam, national liberation movements, anti the apartheid regime in South Africa, this was colored by and, you know, made sense of through the prism of official communism, the CPGB, and the Soviet Union, basically. Okay, in terms of, how should I put it, someone like myself, I mean, what I experienced was a party that didn't know its history. I mean, it heard of Lenin, obviously, and you had pictures of Lenin, and they even studied Lenin, but they didn't really know Bolshevism. Really, where their history began in terms of this is the stuff we put into practice, really was 1935. Dimitrov's speech. We forgot all about Stalin. Dimitrov's speech, the Popular Front. This was the British Road to Socialism. This was the official Communist Party. And it was really also the oppositions in the official Communist Party too. So in terms of, you know, their thought world, this is where it all began. And what I find somewhat hard to explain, somewhat bizarre, is that at the time, Trotsky, I mean, okay, as an analogy, it isn't an exact, it's not an exact fit, but it will do. He described Dimitrov's speech. He described this turn towards popular frontism as the equivalent in terms of the official world communist movement as 1914, August 1914, as far as official social democracy was concerned. For him, a class line had been crossed. There was a qualitative a development as far as he was concerned. And I wouldn't argue with that. I wouldn't say it's the same as 1914, but nonetheless, the point is still there. What I find quite bizarre is latter-day followers of Leon Trotsky put into practice and just don't question those sort of politics. Of course, they don't reference, 1935 and Georgy Dimitrov, but that's what they do, the Anti-Nazi League. It's what the Mandel Fourth International does. There are very few exceptions now on the left that view class collaboration with the petty bourgeoisie or the social movements as somehow intrinsically problematic. Either way, what I want to really get to is the fact that the Communist Party, at least when I experienced it, was a seething mass. Maybe the mass is a bit of an exaggeration. I think there were 30,000 members, just over, when I joined. But anyway, the point would be that it was riven with factions. And I participated in those factions, and I emerged out of that struggle. My own assessment when I joined the YCL, the Young Communist League, in 1969, I was bitterly disappointed. I don't know what I quite had in my head, but when I looked at the Young Communist League, it didn't inspire me, it horrified me. When I looked at the official Communist Party, it didn't inspire me, it horrified me. So I was an oppositionist very early on. And really, in terms of how I developed my politics, I suppose there were two things. And that is, first of all, systematically going back to Lenin, studying the history of Bolshevism, but also, having contact, not just in Britain, but also comrades abroad, and specifically what I'm referencing is communists in Turkey, who had a big early influence on me and encouraged, opened the door, for the sort of communist I am today. But I would also add that while it's right to be highly critical of official communism, I mean, if we look at its programs, to me, they're a lesson in how not to write a program. As far as I can recall, Lawrence, every one that they adopted, even as a draft, almost went out of date as it came off, and sometimes even before it came off the printing press. So, for example, for Soviet Britain, I think that was 1933, the line had changed by 35. Look at the British Road to Socialism and all the rest of it. These were very much news commentaries as well as strategies. But having said that, I go back to this point that the CPGB was still a class party. And however unsuccessful it was, and it was, in terms of the electoral arena, when it came to industrial struggles, it was absolutely central. So, one of my early experiences was the struggle against the Labour parties in place of strife. This was a white paper. It never made its way to legislation. But the Communist Party led political strikes against it. It was defeated because of the leadership of the Communist Party. It was the Communist Party's leadership that also defeated the Industrial Relations Act of Edward Heath, not least when 5 dockers basically deliberately got themselves arrested, defying the laws, were banged up in Pentonville jail, and the working class, led by the Communist Party, and I can assure you it was led by the Communist Party, was bringing people out. It was bringing building workers out, engineering workers out, print workers out, dockers, and you ended with a situation of where the official solicitor, I don't know what role the official solicitor plays, but either way, they were released and carried shoulder high out of Pentonville jail. The role of the Communist Party also shouldn't be forgotten in the 2 miners' strikes in the early 70s, not least, with 3-day week, with Edward Heath going, who rules the country? Is it the trade unions or is it your elected government? Well, it wasn't going to be the elected government of the Tories. It wasn't going to be the elected government of Edward Heath. So I think we need, how should I put it, a balanced view of the CPGB. And all I can say is the decline of the CPGB, the growth of what Lawrence described as the Euro-communist, the rightward drift, the craving for respectability, the weakening of the Communist Party, but also the objective circumstances that it was surrounded by, saw us end up going, at least in my lifetime, joining in at a period of heightened class struggle, of where we seem to be scoring one victory after the other, to the point where we were suffering one defeat after the other. And, particularly what I'm thinking about here is the Great Miners' Strike, where the Communist Party, at least in the form of the Euro-communists, played an absolutely disgusting role. You all know her, Lawrence B. Campbell, and the denunciation of miners' violence as macho violence. Martin Jakes basically turning the miners' strike into a charity event. Nonetheless, communists still played some sort of role, but I think that one of the reasons we lost, and I'm not suggesting that you can defy history, clearly was the decline of the Communist Party. Now, I'm going to finish with this, that you can be a class party, and if you take your lead from what was going on in the Soviet Union, and they were actually still doing that in spite of denouncing the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968, because the whole of the strategy was based on the growth of the socialist countries. Well, it was quite clear that if you look at the so-called socialist countries, if you look at the Soviet Union, it's quite clear that, you shouldn't call it a mode of production. Why? Because it couldn't reproduce itself. It was a historic freak. It had to end. How it ended, there are particular reasons, Gorbachev, the particular date, and all the rest of it. But it wasn't a sustainable system. And therefore, what we're dealing with in terms of global history, of which the CPGB is part, I think, is one of these tragic moments of where the working class attempts to come to power, 1917 and all the rest of it, but fails. And instead of that, what we have is tragedy. And I think that has been the history of the CPGB, a tragedy as far as the advanced part of the working class, both in Britain, but also on a global scale goes. Because what didn't happen, and maybe I had hopes, but I really can't be too self-critical of myself. We didn't have, with the collapse of communism, the rest of the left, the Trotskyist left, the Bourdieuist left, any other genuine left go forward. They suffered isolation. They suffered from that defeat, no matter how morally they distance themselves. So I've just written, for example, an appreciation of Peter Taff, and I still vividly remember him talking about how the Soviet Union cannot collapse, it's a chimera. The idea of it was dismissed, and when it did, he welcomed it as ushering in the red 1990s. No, comrades, what we've lived through isn't red, it's reaction. And that reaction is still on the march. We see it in Europe, we see it in India, we see it in Japan, and above all, we see it in the global hegemon, the United States. With Trump, we are still, in that sense, living under the shadow of the failure of the October Revolution to spread to Europe, and the working class has paid dearly for that, and I think it will continue to pay dearly until we make a break towards a new politics, which requires a radical criticism of what went before. Not an easy dismissal, but a radical engagement with our past. Without that, I don't think that we can go forward. I'll finish with that. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks very much, Jack, and thank you, Lawrence. Comrades, if you have questions, comments, please click raise hand and we'll make you a panelist. I think at the end there, I think you've said almost the most important thing, Jack. It began with a failure. CPGB was born out of failure, and I think that's a really important point on that. Really, my first question. I mean, the CPGB immediately went into Comintern, was a member of Comintern, and membership of Comintern required that you ban factions. You don't, you have a militarized party structures, very, down from the Soviet Union, but then also in Britain, down from the party leadership, etc., etc. So no internal differences allowed, etc. What we do, we are basically a fan club of the Soviet Union, and you have to obey the orders. Do you think was there ever a possibility of not going with Comintern? Was that even on the cards? Was there I mean, some communist parties didn't, and not all the communist parties joined with Comintern after the Russian Revolution. And, could it have developed into something more healthy, or was it so linked to, the experience of the Soviet Union? It wasn't a possibility. And then, the question is, I mean, you mentioned you joined when it was riven with factions, so illegal factions, clearly, but what if a party with open, the kind of party we're trying to build now, which has factions, which allows factions, could that have played a different role in the history of, that important period? That's my question to you first, Jack, and I'm going to ask Lawrence one as well, if you could answer it.
Yeah, useful questions, Tina, thanks. Lawrence, again, will be in a much better position to answer the first one. You talked, I mean, I've only read bits, for the Sunday Worker, but I get the impression from what you say, but also from my own looking at things, there were debates, there were differences. The CPGB shouldn't be thought of, I think, throughout its history as some sort of dead, inert body with orders coming down from on high, and somehow the membership were just a bunch of I don't know, automatons. I mean, you had intellectuals. You know, Lawrence talked about self-educated intellectuals. These people would argue. You know, they would sit in a meeting, they would sit in the pub, they would be in a trade union. You know, they were not, conformists. You know, they were some, you know, the people I met when I joined, although I found it disappointing, they're still some of the best people I've ever met in my life, you know, in terms of people who are rooted in the working class, knew how to talk to people and knew how to lead people and also to learn. Okay. Comintern, I think Comintern was absolutely central to what the CPGB was. Without Comintern, it wouldn't have been the highest achievement with all the faults that we've talked about of the CPGB. I don't know what Communist Party didn't join. I mean, communist groups, maybe, you know, I don't know, Communist Workers' Party in Germany, blah. But these are all fragments that split off. Okay. Again, my reading, not least around the general strike, is that the advice, contrary to the myth, the advice coming from Moscow wasn't appalling. Often it was very intelligent. I think you first of all had Zinoviev, who I think has got a terrible reputation. I'm sure he was a very rude and obnoxious individual. That's what I've read. I don't know why he's got that reputation, but that's his reputation. But after that, you had Bukharin. And again, we can get into Bukharin alliance with Stalin, socialism in one country. Nonetheless, the advice that they were giving to the CPGB was to the left, and it wasn't stupid. It was well-informed, it was intelligent. Now, maybe when you get into class against class, it becomes very different. And actually, I think, and again, Lawrence, I'd be interested to hear your comments on that. My impression was an awful lot of people in the CPGB, I don't know about other parties, mouthed the slogans and then carried on with their day-to-day trade union work, for example. I know there was a split in the bus drivers union and in the mine workers federation, but in general, they paid lip service to it. Either way, the point I really want to get over is that these were lively individuals. So for every conformist you had, you'd have someone who definitely wasn't a conformist, definitely someone with all the limitations of that time could think. And I'll finish with this. One of our first recruits, Mark Fisher, who was on the leadership of the Young Communist League after we launched the Leninist in November 1981, used to make the point to me, and I think he had something of a point there. It's a counterfactual history, but he kept making the point to me, if only you'd launched earlier, then things would have been different. I don't think he would have stopped the liquidation of the party. But quite frankly, by the time we launched the Leninist, things were in dire straits. And we did recruit in the CPGB. And the people we recruited, it's quite interesting. Again, Lawrence, you would sort of see the reason for it. We tended to recruit old gits, people about my age, who'd experienced a third period and sort of liked it. And then we recruited people in the Young Communist League. And so Mark, for example, was kicked out of the Young Communist League, including with the votes of the straight leftists, because we were recruiting other leaders in the Young Communist League. There wasn't much left. But we also recruited people outside the ranks of the Communist Party on the basis precisely that what we needed is a party and not simply a confessional sect. But we've failed so far. And certainly our struggle in the Communist Party obviously failed, with the official liquidation of the Communist Party. But the sentiment that we represented, as the Euros went into their Congress, I can remember it, it was held in the TUC in Congress House. We had a banner outside, "Long live communism." And that's still my view. They declared communism to be dead. Communism hasn't died because human beings are still not free.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, Lawrence, do you want to answer that as well, or talk about that question of factions, etc.?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, Tina's right on one level. Yeah, there was no factions, and so where the factions are to exist, they would be illegal. But there was uh, associations of like-minded party members in the 1920s, just as there was in the 1980s. That was kind of no different. But there might have been no factions, but you could certainly, obviously, there was a debate in the Sunday Worker, but also as well, what the debate that there was in the 20s, from what I've seen, tended to be squirreled away in quite obscure publications like Communist Review, where you in outline you can see Dutt, Palm Dutt, who's the party's leading intellectual, pulling to the left. You could see so and so pulling to the right, and you can see that there was the two factions, unofficial factions of the CPGB in the 1920s. One which was kind of broadly um, uh, wanted to carry on working inside the Labour Party, and that was most of the old leadership who got shifted out in 1929. And there was also a kind of younger group around Pollitt, Palm Dot, and others as they went on, who voiced their dissatisfaction with the way work was going in the national left-wing movement. And that carried on through the CPGB's history. So no, you didn't have factions. But by the time there was always debate inside CPGB journals. The period where there was least debate, I would say, is the 30s, but there were from the 1945, when there was an explosive debate in the party press about the failures of the party, right through to the end. There was always oppositional voices, and it's a very sad fact to observe. But there was more room for expression of dissidents inside the old CPGB than there would be in today's SWP. That's that you had far more rights, and by the time that these big unofficial factions started to emerge from the 60s and 70s, that gave you a measure, like John would have had a measure of protection against his activities being curtailed because he was part of a bigger faction, and that matters actually. And the leadership knew all about all of that. They would have known exactly who John was, exactly that he was in affiliation with X, Y, and Z, and so it didn't kind of matter really because the factions were there. So yeah, you're quite right, Tina, in that there was no formal factions, but the informality of it was kind of always there. I don't think the CPGB could have been formed without the Comintern. And I think if you look in the early issues of The Communist, which is the CPGB's first journal, it's clear they admired the Russians, and they had no idea that somebody called Joe Stalin was going to become General Secretary in 1925 and be an arsehole. Yeah, they didn't. Their perspective was that the Russian comrades had prestige because they'd won a successful revolution. Lenin took his time with the left of the CPGB to debate out, and Lenin wasn't deemed to be a master strategist. He was deemed to be a good tactician, and that's why people like left-wing communism. So I think we shouldn't see things through the long end of the telescope. Also, as well, I do agree with John on the advice thing. So, for example, you can pick out the Moscow State Archive, you can look at a debate with Bukharin, who was soon to be deposed from the leadership of the CPSU, 1927, and he's debating with the leaders of the CPGB. Obviously, the third period has started to come, and they're thinking about yanking organisations like the CPGB out of organisations like the Labour Party. And Bukharin, yes, Bukharin has started to accede to some of the third period, and it's obviously going to the left, and obviously the CPGB is going to be drawn out. But then the CPGB, I think it was Gallagher, asked Bukharin a direct question, which is kind of listed, and said, Comrade Bukharin, would you then say that we should withdraw all our members and not vote for Labour Party anywhere. And straight away, Bakarian comes back and says, well, actually, you need to be careful. I wouldn't make a general rule. So even in the midst of going into like madness, and the Comintern told the CPGB not to close the national left-wing movement in 29, the CPGB decided to do that themselves. In amongst all the madness, it wasn't so bad in the 20s. I think that relationship only became toxic, fully toxic, somewhat later. The counterfactual history of the Leninists and other fascists is interesting. I suppose I took Marx's thesis that if only the Leninists could have been launched in 1981. I actually kind of used that in a book I wrote called The Kick Inside because I thought it was an interesting kind of thing. But I interviewed Mark about it and why he made that point. And what we're arguing here is why, why didn't any kind of left-wing oppositions kind of win in the 1980s? I think this is what we're kind of getting into here. And Mark just said to me that when he was a kid in South Wales, you could meet lots of CPGB members who were like kind of rooted in the class. They were members of trade unions, they were councillors, whatever. But he would meet also lots of people in the party who just described themselves as revolutionaries, of subjective revolutionaries, and he thought there were thousands. Now I don't know whether Mark's memory had got cloudy. So I do think that counterfactual thing is interesting, and it has to be said that before the Leninist, which I think was a good. Yes, it failed, but it was a leap forward from what had gone before. The older factions, the pro-Soviet factions, pretty terrible politics, I have to say, and also themselves infected by opportunism, revisionism, and some kind of awful pro-Soviet politics on occasion as well. But yeah, that's it. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. Thanks, Conrad. Ian's got a question or a comment. Hello.
Just two brief questions, really, mostly to Lawrence. The impact of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. I mean, it's easy to look at it now and go, well, that can only count as one of the most awful betrayals imaginable in its history. Well, what was the impact within the Communist Party of Great Britain? Because presumably people had to do all sorts of backward somersaults with the division of Poland and the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and then the other aspect I wanted to ask about was the Spanish Civil War, because of course many courageous communists went off to fight. Notably, people like George Orwell, who was in the Independent Labour Party, couldn't join the International Brigade, although he was subsequently asked to join it, but was already by then in the POUM militia and gone on the side of the POUM rather than the International Brigade. But the impact of all of that on membership, and how did it play out in terms of both party membership and also in terms of any kind of discussion? Was there any open discussion in the literature, or was it all just simply, as has often been portrayed, just simply the daily work of following the party line, the Comintern line, before the Comintern was dissolved, of course?
Thanks, Ian. We've got a few people now with their hands up, so I suggest I'll take a couple more comments before I bring the speakers back. Ken, hi.
Hello. Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Jack. I'd like to go back to the point where Lawrence mentioned the split between the CPGB and the CPB, the Communist Party of Britain. And I'd be interested to know his view on how far that split still rankles, if you like, and how far there might be a prospect of some kind of reconciliation, some kind of coming together with the current fusion process that might bring those two bodies under the same umbrella. Thank you.
Thanks. One more, maybe Peter.
Hi there. Thanks, Jack and Lawrence. Just a question maybe to both of you, because it seems to apply. I just wanted your opinion on the broader issues of social democracy collapsing, as well as the Soviet Union, and how that manifested in the split with the liquidation of the CPGB. We don't appear to have discussed specifically that those tensions between the two tonight. Yet, particularly in relation to Britain, anyway, because it seems to me that Euro-communists, as a splitting faction, came about in parallel with the slow dissolution of the Soviet Union, but really the collapse of social democracy. And it leads me to think that there's two things going on which is the reason for the longevity of the CPGB, and that is their adherence to a kind of British way which is fused with social democracy, and a view of like Marxism, which came to be destroyed by Stalinism, and it lacked the kind of vision of communism, which is any different from what was going on in the Soviet Union. And so the concept, the broader context, really, the structure, and once that kind of unwound, then we kind of, in my opinion, we get the unwinding of the CPGB, and there's lessons to be learned in that as well.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to bring in Jack first. I think that last question maybe perhaps sounds like something you could reply to, and of course any other comments you want to reply to from comrades. And then
I'll
Lauren.
be very brief. That's a useful question, Peter. I mean, I think that it's undeniable that if we look at the decline of the Labour left, the collapse of the social democratic consensus, looking at, I don't know, Corbyn, people talked about him having a socialist program, but you can't be serious about that. I mean, quite frankly, Wilson was closer to reformist socialism, let alone Attlee. Basically, what Corbyn was putting forward was a kinder, nicer capitalism. I mean, that's the honest view. So I think, yes, what we're dealing with here is both the slow decline and final collapse of the Soviet Union, and tied to that, the official communist movement, but also tied to that, social democracy. I agree. And clearly, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, as far as the ruling class was concerned, job done. And the end of any substantive concessions, and then the time of taking back concessions that had been granted in previous period. Just in terms, I'd like to just touch on the Morning Star and the CPB. My own view, I mean, I think this is something for the future. My own view would be that, I think that it's an incredibly weak organization. And that's saying something when we look around the rest of the left, because the whole left is incredibly weak. I don't know, Ken. I mean, it strikes me that, for example, if we got a phone call, if we got an email from comrades inside the CPB, I would tell them to stay and fight, right? And I would tell them, urge them, advise them precisely to stay in and fight, but also to orientate themselves to what's going on in terms of forging communist unity. You can do both, you can chew gum and all the rest of it at the same time. But I have to tell you the truth about it. I am not particularly hopeful. I think we have to go through the existing left. How much of the existing left we win, I don't know. But yes, we need to go through the CPB. We shouldn't just dismiss it. It's got a daily paper. It still has some influence, but I wouldn't put my money on it. I'll finish with that, Tina.
Thanks, Jack. Lawrence.
Yeah, so I'll pick up the things that Ian asked. Ian asked about the Hitler-Stalin Pact and Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939. This was when the Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact, which basically allowed Hitler to go into Poland and the partition of Poland, and effectively, it was one of the, it opened up a gate towards the Second World War, and Stalin was deemed to have been doing a pact with the devil, because all Stalin was really interested in was keeping people away from the Soviet Union. Well, obviously, there was a huge impact upon the CPGB, which led to the General Secretary, Harry Pollitt, who was an advocate of the old CPGB's slogan of an anti-fascist war against Germany. He lost his post as General Secretary. J.R. Campbell, or I can't remember whether he was Daily Worker editor or not at that point. He also stepped back, and that those comrades both had to produced humiliating recantations to say how wrong that they were for opposing the CPGB's new anti-war line. As a result of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the CPG then had to oppose kind of any war, oppose the imperialist war as they called it at that point. And so, yeah, there was a huge impact. And also their party's only MP, Gallagher, he actually agreed with Pollitt and Campbell and thought the new line, he argued internally, the new line was nonsense, and and didn't like the pact. But he was allowed, actually, given he was their MP, he was allowed to. They were allowed to like hide that kind of issue away, and Gallagher wasn't publicly included in the humiliating kind of I was wrong kind of articles in kind of Daily Worker. So it had a huge impact on them. However, when you look into the research on the rank and file in general, there were some who didn't like this pact, but in general, the rank and file, because the rank and file, obviously, given it's the CPGB, and they were prepared to follow the twists and turns of Stalin's diplomacy, and a lot of them weren't bothered about it, and quite a lot of them were more happy with calling the war an imperialist kind of war. So they didn't see any big anti-fascist kind of betrayal in it. And the basic thing is there wasn't a big walkout of members, and even though Pollitt and signed recantations, they also stayed loyal to the party, and the party boasted about how united it was and how it had overcome. Because obviously the bourgeois media commented a lot on this big spat because they'd got wind of it, and Pollitt being removed as general secretary, that was on the front page of newspapers. There's a famous photograph of him walking out of King Street after he'd been effectively sacked. But the rank and file mostly didn't, there was actually quite a lot of research done into it, and the responses of members was along the lines of things like good old Stalin, the old fox, he slipped the trap, kind of thing, in that he hasn't let himself be pulled into doing Britain's dirty work and opposing Hitler and Eastern Europe. So, because it was an organization that had trust in the Soviet Union and trust in the leadership of Stalin. So yeah, so surprisingly, and then you look at, even it's often thought that the intellectuals didn't like the Nazi Soviet non-aggression pact. That's not always true either. Some really disliked it, and some people around the people that they'd incorporated into the kind of Popular Front and the Left Book Club, there was a big fallout there. But some of the party intellectuals, like the writer Edward Upward, were quite happy with the new line and didn't. So in it, they were used to following the twists and turns of Soviet diplomacy. So a lot of them had followed the party from the third period into the Popular Front. Spanish Civil War, I don't know much about any internal opposition to that, Ian. It's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I'll try and look into that and try and find something out. On the CPB, which Jack commented, I mean, I'd go along with what Jack said. If you're in the CPB and you've got oppositional thoughts, and yeah, you should stay and fight your corner inside the CPB or the YCL, and you should fight that out and orientate towards forging communist unity. I'm not hopeful like Jack. I'm slightly more hopeful about some of the younger comrades in the YCL who are at the moment on a receiving end of a big pushback after we had the episodes of like waving red flags and chanting Stalin's name a couple of years ago. They are on the receiving end of they are being pushed back against and they're being lent on. But what we probably all say to those comrades is really you need to develop some politics and develop your ideas. And if you say you're revolutionary, you need to start espousing revolutionary ideas. Waving red flags and all that kind of stuff is great, but it's not enough, and they're being found out, I think, and they're under pressure because they haven't got politics that are distinct enough from the CPB majority. And I find that the problem with the CPB specifically to Ken is that I'd find the reason I don't hold out much hope is the General Secretary of the CPB, Rob Griffiths, wrote a book a couple of years ago collecting his essays called The Gleam of Socialism, actually, it was called. It's interesting, and comrades should actually spend some time looking at it. But what's interesting to me is that we've discussed this, that the irony of the British road to socialism is, and I'd say this back to Jack, yes, it failed as a CPGB strategy, but it certainly became the ideology of the Labour left and an animating idea of the Labour left. That's true. But the CPB's just been through an instance where its programme, the British Road to Socialism, and it was very supportive of Corbyn, and very supportive of Corbyn, turned itself into like a flag waver for Corbyn really during those years. That strategy's had a fairly humiliating rebuff. This steady tracking to the left under Corbyn. So that as a but Rob Griffiths in the Gleam of Socialism, bless him, says that there's going to be no strategic change or rethinking to the CPBs. Now, I think if you've had that kind of reverse and that kind of, and we all know here, like everybody on this call will know what the, even pathetic though the Corbyn rebellion was, what a defeat that's been. To actually not have any rethinking, to not actually then begin to question programs like the British Road to Socialism. Didn't this make you think that the Labour left is always tied to the Labour centre, which is tied to the Labour right? Wasn't Corbyn in the pocket of his right wing effectively for all his leadership? There's been no rethinking. So, like Jack, I've gotten very little. Yeah, that's not a great kind of sign, but we just have to put our faith that the younger comrades do actually develop a proper rebellion and they orientate to forging communist unity, because you don't have to put up with the CPB if you don't want to. But as like I say, we wouldn't advise you to leave it, comrades. That's it.
Not without a fight, for sure. Rafal, would you like to unmute yourself, please?
Hello. I have a question to both panelists on, I think the topic was touched on earlier, but specifically on the straight left tendency within the CPGB. And because to my understanding, this was a tendency that was, reasonably significant, opposed to the Euro-communist liquidationist faction that was in the leadership, had I believe was fairly well organized in London, at least, but seemed to be completely incapable, and projected this image of being these very hard tankies, kind of edgy, as opposed to the soft liberal conciliationists in the leadership, but was completely incapable of mobilizing against the liquidationists and making even any effort to preserve the party. You have these other splits. You have the NCP, you have the Morning Star group break off, even the Leninist, which was a fairly fringe publication with a very small membership that keeps control of the name and actually organize and persist to this day, whereas the straight left seems to sort of just completely disappear into the ether altogether with Marxism Today and the Euro-communist leadership. So is it a question of they never had a program and were not capable of ever standing up to leadership? Did the collapse of the Soviet Union shock them so much that they were just paralyzed? Was it a question of waiting too long, because the NCP breaks off sort of first, and then the CPB does with the Morning Star, and my understanding is that the straight left had viewed this as a betrayal, and were unwilling to go along with them and stayed in the CPGB. So did they wait too long, or were they hoping that it had, I don't know, had the NCP and the CPB group stayed within the party, could straight left have had a constituency sufficient to try anything, or was it always doomed? Thank you.
Thanks, Raphael. Paul, please.
Yeah, I'll have to excuse my voice. I've got a filthy cold at the moment. The Soviet-German Pact 1939 and the ensuing war on Finland actually played a major role, not so much in the Communist Party itself, as Lawrence said, it stayed pretty much together with the necessary demotion of Pollitt and Campbell over their support for the old line, which was rendered obsolete by the pact of supporting the war. But what you got was this big explosion in parts of these sort of fellow traveling areas, such as Tribune magazine, which had a strange line of carrying on with the pre-pact pro-war line of the Comintern and supporting the pact at the same time. It's really weird. The guy in charge of Tribune at the time was a guy called Hartshorn, who was, as far as I know, either a member or but very close to the Communist Party. Connie Ziliakis, whom Lawrence mentioned, was the paper's diplomatic correspondent. He was responsible for this strange duality in the line. But eventually they came out against Soviet foreign policy with the invasion of Finland in end of November. I had a piece in the Weekly Worker a couple of years ago on this, because what the Finnish war did was to bring into British politics an adoration, a first inkling of the anti-communist popular front of the late 1940s, where social democracy, the right wing of social democracy, took up the anti-communist line that had been put forward by liberals and conservatives. In other words, the Soviet Union was an imperialist stroke revolutionary threat to Western values, civilization, and all the rest of it. This was the first time that right-wing social democracy took up this line as a sort of a ruling motif. Now, it didn't last long, because Finland capitulated in, I think it was March, after putting up quite a fight. And of course, a year later, the Soviet Union was allied with Britain, and it was almost sort of treasonous after then to criticize the Soviet Union in Britain. But it was very important. That question of the Finnish Winter War, which was partly a result of the Soviet-German Pact, was a major factor in the development of bourgeois politics in Britain, and it's the impact of bourgeois politics on right-wing social democracy. This goes forward through to the late 1940s. Now, again, Lawrence referred to the Labour Independent Group, which was 5 former Labour MPs, one of whom, Dennis Noel Pritt, who I once described as a budding British Brzezinski, was expelled from the Labour Party for supporting the Soviet line on Finland. So he was expelled on political grounds in 1940. He joined up with 4 Labour MPs who took a pro-Soviet line, and that's John Platts Mills, Leslie Solly, and Lester Hutchinson, and Connie Ziliakis. Now, Ziliakis fell out with them because he backed Tito during the Yugoslav-Soviet split in 1949. But they stood against, excuse me, they stood against Labour, and here's their pamphlet at the time, that's their manifesto. Now, what's interesting about it is basically a not very left Labour document, and the programme starts somewhat significantly, friendship with USSR. So that was the crucial thing. The politics in it weren't that important. In fact, if you ignored the stuff on the Soviet Union, most Labour Party MPs would have supported it. It was harking back to the 45 Labour government and saying how much Labour's moved away from it, and so forth. That's what you got there. But it's interesting that lots of people were saying, and Lawrence again alluded to that there were a lot of Labour MPs who sort of were fellow travellers, certainly not by 1948-49. The biggest thing which really made the Soviet Union unpopular was the Stalinist takeover in Czechoslovakia. That really did for fellow travelling within the Labour Party. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry to rush comrades along. We've got 20 minutes left and we've got 3 more people who want to speak. So please, comrades, if you could speak in a tight fashion. Stanley, hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks. I was just, so I wanted to get at maybe like some of the implicit differences between the 2 presentations, because it seems like, Jack, you were saying that despite everything, even up until like the 60s, 70s, 80s, you could describe the CPGB as kind of a class party. And so in some sense, that's where the action was still at. Whereas Lawrence, I feel like you have you maybe see something there in like the early 20s up till maybe the 30s. And then that's when it all starts to take a turn, and it's kind of a gradual slide since then. Yeah, I wondered if you could comment on that, but also I wanted to know if, in light of that, do you see any potential in anything sort of outside of the orbit of the CPGB? For example, the New Left in the 50s, 60s, what about Trotskyism, even though, obviously that's failed too, but like, was there something there? That's the question from me.
Thanks, Stanley. Jack and Lawrence, do you want to reply now, or shall I take 2 more speakers? 2 more? It's okay with you, Lawrence? Yep, okay. William and Ant, but please could you keep it just to a few minutes each? Thank you.
Yeah, well, do my best to be brief. To get back to the original organization of the CPGB, which was as far as I know, in 1920, there was a lot of progressive socialist groupings that were not allowed into the CPGB. And that's because they had they had an anti-imperialist line that went against the narrative of the majority of the British working class, because the British working class felt that they were entitled to have an empire, simple as that. Now, the organizations that I'm talking about are the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party was a small party. It was an anti-imperialist party and had a very progressive policy on everything. Now, the man who took over the leadership of the 1916 Rising on 3 days before, on the second day before the surrender, was a fellow called Sean McLaughlin. Now, Connolly passed his leadership over to him because Connolly was after getting seriously wounded. Now, he lived in England after at the time of the CPGB being formed, and he would not join the CPGB for the very reason he felt they were pro-imperialist, and he was dead right. They were pro-imperialist, right? That was that. Now, another one that went into the same, didn't join, was John McLean in Scotland, who had a very, very articulate and progressive attitude on the national questions in both Ireland and in Scotland. That went totally against the CPGB's line, and still does. The CPGB at the minute, they only want, or the CPP, or whatever they call themselves, they want a federation. They don't want Scotland to have any kind of independence. Right. Now, they produced in 1920 a pamphlet, which is, I have here, which is a load of absolute nonsense. No paper doesn't refuse ink. But this fella who tries to write on the British Communist stand on Irish self-determination knows very little about self-determination and knows absolutely nothing about Ireland. And that's what was sent around for to educate the British working class. Now, also, another anti-imperialist and a very good anti-imperialist was Sylvia Pankhurst, and she was thrown out because of her anti-empire lines. They will tell you it wasn't. It was because she wouldn't hand her magazine over to the leadership and to be scrutinised by the leadership of the party. It was not that. She had a very, very good anti-imperialist line, and she was against the empire in the same way as McLaughlin and McLean. That was that. Now, this manifested itself again when it came to the Spanish Civil War. In the Spanish Civil War, the English set up the Oliver Cromwell Brigade, which I believe. Now, that was like a red flag to a bull to Ireland. They'd done nothing only this were disparaging and disgusting, and yes, I'm going to stop, towards the Irish. So much so, at one stage, they arrested all the Irish for being drunk, even though a lot of the Irish were teetotallers. They were still arrested for being drunk. And 2 of the British battalion were ex-Black and Tans. Now, what kind of an organisation would allow Black and Tans join them? Only the British Communist Party. They went through the British Communist Party and ended up in the International Brigade. They actually murdered, one of them, a fellow called Natal, murdered the Lord Mayor of Limerick. He was recognised by some people from the Irish Battalion. And the Irish Battalion court-martialed him and sentenced him to death. But the Spaniards wouldn't allow it because they said they needed him for training because he was an ex-officer in the British Army. And this is how he has never got you. The fact that you can't face your own history is the reason why you don't have a Communist Party. And you'll never have a Communist Party. And that also manifested itself in the way Corbyn was absolutely decimated in the election that he was defeated in.
Okay, thanks, William. And please.
Okay, I'm going to keep this really brief. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. To me, the reason that we look at history is to learn the lessons and to draw up the balance. And in my opinion, in the opinion of the tradition that I belong to, the communist left, you have not really made the break with Stalinism. I don't know if you can see this, the title of the book, Russia, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. Yes, Stalinism was the product of the counter-revolution, and the counter-revolution was the failure of the world revolution. There was absolutely no chance of building socialism in Russia or any other isolated country. Any measures taken in backward, decimated, isolated Russia were not socialist at all. In the absence of the possibility of construction of socialism, what was left apart from a variant of capitalism? And I think dressing up, state ownership, nationalization, and whatever other departures from classical 19th century capitalism, as socialism, is simply failing to understand what socialism is, and giving the working class a distorted view of what socialism is. So socialism is nothing to do with the capitalist state or any other state which is not directly the result of the power of the working class nationalizing, or I don't know, giving out freebies or welfare or any other measure which mitigates the impact of capitalism. I think as I understand it, or my question is, if you think that Stalinism was not a capitalist variant, then was there something to defend there? What was Stalinism something that the working class should have shed blood for? I think that as far as I understand it, Trotskyism answered in the affirmative. But and I'm going to say that Trotskyism, was incapable of a real break with Stalinism. Also, according to Trotsky, the dictatorship of the proletariat stood under Stalin. How can the dictatorship of the proletariat stand when the working class had no power whatsoever? It was ferociously exploited. It was treated horrifically. So I'm just going to simply say that until you can make the real break with Stalinism, you've not learned the lessons. You cannot sell something as socialism which simply isn't. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. And I think both our speakers have well and truly broken with Stalinism. And we're going to talk about this issue, as I mentioned before. So Russian Revolution and Soviet Union, age of the Soviet Union, etc. We are going to discuss in the next few sessions. So we're trying to concentrate on the history of the CPGB. And when both speakers now summing up, I think you have about 5, 6, 7 minutes each. We can overrun a little bit. Perhaps you could also touch, and that does touch on what Stanley was asking, really. Where do you see, I know, Lawrence, you've written about, there was no golden age of the CPGB. The maximum numbers, I think, was something like 60,000 and 45. So it wasn't really it was the advanced section of the working class, but it wasn't really a party of millions and millions. But do you see like, a silver age? What was for you sort of the best period of the CPGB, and what can we learn from it for our efforts today, really? If both of you could touch on that when you're summing up. Jack, could you go first, please?
Well, there are many lessons to learn from the CPGB, many of them negative, but my own take on it has never been let's look back to some golden age or silver age or bronze age. Because we're going forward and we're operating in the world that we are. So I've never taken the view, 1926 or 1920. There are lessons, of course there are, precisely because I would still make the argument that what we were dealing with was a class party. I don't know about Lawrence, whether you would accept that. I think you would in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So I don't think there's actually a difference on that. Just for Ant, I know we're coming to the Soviet Union. I don't know if I'm speaking on it. Ant, I don't know. I think you read the Weekly Worker, but if you do, have a look at some of my articles. I talk about counter-revolution in the revolution. The idea that the Soviet Union, by the way, in the 1930s was capitalist, I think is slightly bonkers, but we can talk about that, as Tina said. William, I think you're a nationalist. I think you're looking at things through micro-nationalist glasses and coming to completely...
I'm an internationalist and you're a nationalist.
I think you're a very nationalist communist, if I can use that maybe you're not even a communist, but you seem to be basically dominated by a nationalist outlook. And your sort of test is it Ireland or breakaway Scotland? To me, that isn't communism, it's nationalism. Stanley, you asked, I think, an interesting question about Trotskyism. Look, we've all come through a shit period in history. And my own view isn't to look at everybody else before me or whatever and say, they're all rubbish. They're all traitors. You know, there's no value in some of these people, and I include the Trotskyists, they were all trying to deal with a situation that no one could have predicted. And so, okay, Ant thinks it's capitalism. I think that's bollocks. It's the dictatorship of the proletariat. Bollocks. I agree. Okay, they got it wrong. What do you expect? So, okay, could Trotskyism have broken through? No, I don't think so. Because of the world situation, I think we'd been defeated. The question to me is, you know, what went down with the Russian Revolution was Marxist theory degenerated, and that wasn't inevitable, right? But again, that's a separate subject. Last point in my remaining 2 minutes, maybe. I think, Raphael, you asked some very interesting questions. I can't give you a quick answer. I was associated, if you want to find out about straight left, talk to Lawrence, talk to me. I was there. They were very well organized. They had national schools, student schools. We had a YCL faction, Scotland, Wales, you name it, everywhere. Yes, it failed totally. Fergus Nicholson, the leader of it, I don't know. I think with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the decline of the Soviet Union, he was completely disorientated, utterly disorientated. But you have to say that went for all official communists. I mean, I did note down I'm going to finish with this one, Lawrence. You talked about Robert Griffiths being should be disorientated by Corbyn. He should certainly think about it. Look, in my little book, Which Road, this was written in 1991. I made the prediction with the CPB, with their British Road to Socialism. They still called it that then, that the Soviet Union collapsed and they won't change it. They'll just airbrush out the Soviet Union. And that's what happened. So these people are not thinkers. They're not trying to learn from history. And that is the point of studying history. It's not just to remember a few facts or, you know, stand up there and show how superior we are. We need to learn from it. So yes, we need to learn about what was the Soviet Union, what was the CPGB, what was good about it, what was bad about it, what positive lessons can we learn, and what things will we never do again. So that's the purpose, I think, of these sessions. Anyway, I'll finish there, Tina. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Lawrence.
Yeah, on Raphael's point, I'd go along with what Jack said. Really, I think the straight left were incredibly well organised. You know, this was an organisation that would produce a daily bulletin on what was going on at our conference and sneak it in comrades' prams to avoid the Euro-communist goons on the door. They had an alternative. You know, they had a structure, they had a leadership. In some ways, they were quite impressive. But then you look at the actual the weekly paper, or I can't remember if it's weekly or monthly. I think it was weekly. Straight left. It was just the politics of it were just dreadful. And the kind of problem really with straight left is that that as an organisation that attempted to fight against the liquidation of the CPGB, lots of its politics had ingested the poison of the past 40 years. So take, for example, their perspective on the Labour Party. They said the Labour Party was the federal party of the working class and that the CPGB should never stand against it in elections. We would call that in the context of the CPGB at that point, that was liquidationist kind of politics. And Fergus Nicholson, when he had to go into print and talk about things like the British road to socialism, he actually ummed and ahed and hedged his bets. And he said something like, 25,000 words can't all be bad, or some opportunist bollocks about that. And the reality of it was Fergus Nicholson knew Stalin had overseen the BRS, and so therefore you're led into a different world. And their strategy was following whatever first it was Stalin, then it was Khrushchev, then it was Brezhnev, and then in the end it was Gorbachev, because they hailed Gorbachev too. They'd ingested the poison that they claimed to be fighting. So yeah, but yeah, it's interesting. I thank you, Paul Flewers, for your detail, and I'll read that pamphlet. I haven't read that pamphlet. It's very interesting, that Paul, and I recommend Paul's article on the Finnish war that was in the Weekly Worker. It's well worth reading. But thank you for that, Paul. Stanley did raise an interesting question about whether there's a difference between me and John. Well, probably not. I do see the 1920s. I wouldn't go as far, Tina, as to call it a Bronze Age or a Silver Age, because I think that that you just get into you end up getting into, this is a better period. I do think that the party in the 1920s, I think it was probably centrist. I think it was probably bureaucratic centralist in some degree, but I do think that some of the things that the party did in the 20s were quite inspiring, actually. Despite all the flaws and the defeats in the general strike and the national left-wing movement, you look at those politics and the way the later CPGB really didn't want to talk about. It really didn't want to, until Monty Johnson wrote some articles in the 70s about the CPGB knew fuck all about what had happened in the 1920s. I'm talking about the organisation in the 1970 and 1960. So I do see the 1920s as being, I don't know, it's not an example for the future. It's not one that I would follow. I wouldn't, if something came out of Forging Communist Unity that had that type of, party culture, I'd be a bit worried, actually. But I don't think it will. So on Stanley's question, the problem with Trotskyism was really the problem of straight left, I think, in the sense that Trotskyism ingested a lot of the poison that it claimed to be fighting and I limit it to one example. Lots of Trotskyists, although they won't admit it, they have the same history of Bolshevism that Stalin actually wrote in the 1938 quack history of the Bolshevik Party. And you look at an organization like the Spartacus League, and they have it's the same bloody history written by a different person. And they've ingested all of Stalinism's bad ideas about bureaucratic centralism, so on and so forth. So I think that's the problem. And I'd say the same with the New Left as well. The New Left had actually ingested quite a lot that was wrong with the Labour movement they were meant to be critiquing. There's not really a difference in terms of the class party. Just on the class party, the CPGB still was a class party right to the end. If you look at the miners' strike, Arthur Scargill, where had Arthur Scargill been trained? Arthur Scargill was trained by his father. In politics, his father was a communist. Arthur Scargill was a member of Barnsley White Young Communist League who stood up to denounce critics of the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary in 1956. He was a product of the YCL. That's where he learned his politics. Similarly, in the NUM, the Union of Mine Workers in the 1980s, Mick McGaughey was Scargill's deputy. Maybe I'm making that up, but he was on the leadership. And there was also the Kent miners were led by CPGB members, and so on and so forth. So even in this last gasp, really, in the miners' strike, in the great miners' strike, it was CPGB politics, good and bad for the most part. Obviously, some parts of Scargill were good, but I'm not going to get into too much into that. But the problem with the miners was the crisis of the CPGB. And so, no, I do actually want to round on this, because people after the last session, not on this call, have accused me of being overly sentimental about the CPGB. I don't have any sentimental about the CPGB, but the reason you have to learn from the CPGB is that what's happened to the CPGB has been repeated in microcosm across the rest of the left, and until you actually learn that history and you engage with it and without labeling it or just study it and work out its contradictions, I don't think comrades will be able to make much sense of the 21st century and building a communist party in the 21st century. But do we want to spend all day talking about the CPGB? Well, I don't mind doing that, but I'm sure the rest of you've got a life and you want to discuss other kind of things. But if you don't learn from your history, you're just doomed to repeat it. It's an old saying, but it's a pretty good one. So that's it.
Yeah. 2 hours today was enough, and it was very good. Thank you very much, both Lawrence and Jack, and for good contributions from the floor, interesting discussions. We'll send out the next sessions of the program soon, but yes, so the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union will be discussed in at least 2 or 3 sessions coming up next. Thanks very much, comrades.
Thanks,
See you.
Tina. Cheers.
Bye.